for a number of years now. She does incredibly inspiring and powerful work. Dr. Jacqueline D'warte is a senior lecturer in School of Education at Western Sydney University, Australia. Dr. D'warte is Deputy Leader of the Equity, Social Justice and Inclusion Research Group at Western Sydney University, and her research examines connections between language, identity, and learning in culturally and linguistically diverse settings. Her recent research engages teachers and young people as ethnographers of their own language and literacy practices as part of regular classroom practice. Her recent publications include a 2021 special issue in LTR, Building on Students' Plurilingual Repertoires Across Educational Contexts. And today, she is going to be talking about reframing language in teaching and learning, building on plurilingual repertoires in mainstream classrooms. Dr. D'warte, thank you very much, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Rahat. And thank you for attending the session. Welcome, everyone. It's a total joy to be here and to be included in such a dynamic research conference that includes many of the scholars that inform all of the work that I've done across my career. So thank you for inviting me, and of course to Rahat, who also does incredible, inspiring work. Thank you. Today I'm going to begin by I've sent you some slides, so they're sort of an abridged version of what I'm going to talk about. So that you can actually look at those as we move forward. So I know this is the end of the day for you, but it's very early morning for me. And so I'm going to try to keep this as dynamic and engaging as I possibly can throughout the session. So I would like to begin, first of all, by acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Darug people. That's where I'm sitting today, of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land in which my research takes place, which is the Darug and the Tharawal people. And I'd also like to pay my respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging, who might be with us today. So to begin this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing, and then I'm going to my theoretical and pedagogical framing, and then I'm going to turn to this research project that I have been conducting in schools and share some of the work that's been taking place through the lens of the work that the teachers and the students have done in this project. So in terms of global reforms in educational studies, I think what's important to consider is all of the current global trends that we have towards this notion of thinking about multilingual pedagogies, building on the linguistic diversity of our education systems, the global linguistic, cultural, religious, social diversity that we have in most classrooms currently. So I think the recent notion of the multilingual turn in educational scholarship really offers us a paradigm shift in the ways that we can view multilingualism as part of a dynamic, flexible repertoire. And it kind of offers us a new lens through which to examine local and global multilingual meaning making. I think in this way, we begin to challenge the monolingual bias, monolingual, monocultural bias that exists, I think, certainly in educational policy, curriculum and assessment in English-speaking countries, in the global north and in the global south. And many scholars would argue, just in terms of this notion of the monolingual turn and its larger acceptance, is that multilingualism is mainstream. It's normalised, it's dynamic. And this has always been the case in the global south, and particularly in Australia, where we build on a rich tradition of over 1,000 Aboriginal languages. I think what longitudinal research has told us, so we've got these broad notions from UNESCO about multilingual world. We have a whole range of new research institutes that are actually funding and promoting research, multilingual research within classrooms, but the longitudinal work that's been going on for a number of years tells us that the repertoires of young people in particular are multilingual, multimodal, and they engage in rich practices and experiences far outside of the things that we would think are actually taking place. So longitudinal research is continuing to show us this incredibly rich linguistic strength and the way that it's dynamic and occurs in a whole range of different spaces and places. We've also got this research that suggests that there's an enhanced capacity, cognitive capacity in learning a first language and in actually building on multilingual skills. And so the more work we do, the more we acknowledge this idea of a multilingual world in education, the more we recognize how important this is for the cognitive capacity of all students, not just those students who speak English as an additional language or dialect. What we definitely know from the research that is the relationship between identity, agency, and power, and the social benefits that come from supporting students in using their first language, and how that plays out in notions of identity and belonging, particularly in classrooms. But unfortunately, we still have this larger body of research that suggests that often we have these low expectations and deficit perspectives of multilingual learners, because we're focused quite a lot, and it's not a criticism of anyone or teachers in particular, but we're focused on the notion of working towards English in terms of curriculum and assessment. And so we're focusing on what's missing, what's lacking, rather than the rich skills and understandings that we can build on. I think certainly in terms of working with teachers, which is what I do in classrooms, and I have to say that I'm sharing work here from my project, but the work is created by incredible teachers and young people in classrooms that I have been working with. And I think in education, certainly as a teacher educator and as someone who works with in-service teachers, we have this notion of a tank of language, this large tank that we're trying to fill up. And I think Professor Garcia in education, along with lots of other people, have given us this wider understanding of the notion of language learning and this idea of a dynamic bilingualism, that we've got an interactive plurality of skills in one or more dialects or registers in this tank. And what they do is offer incredibly rich potential for meaning making. So rather than actually, I think the idea was that we actually have these, certainly in terms of bilingualism, these two tanks that we dip in and out of. Here we're recognizing that this repertoire gives us multiple opportunities for meaning making. And that is all students, not just students who are, we could name as multilingual, but the ways that we communicate and use dialects across a range of registers and spaces and styles, etc., really enriches our understandings and helping us to think about new ways of knowing, being, and doing that come from this exploration of the languages and cultural experiences we have. In terms of pedagogical framing for the work that I'm doing in classrooms, I'm really looking at this relationship between identity, agency, and power in language learning. And I'm sure quite a lot of you are familiar with the Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy by Paris and Lim. And this idea of, and I certainly think this is a focus of our conference today, the idea of perpetuating and fostering and sustaining a linguistic, literate and cultural pluralism as part of the schooling project. How do we put multilingualism, multiple languages, transcultural practices at the center of teaching and learning? And so culturally linguistic responsive pedagogies are informed by this social justice agenda. And these are some of the things that certainly have been informing the work that we're doing, and I'm sure that you've been doing in your classrooms as well. One of the things we're focusing on, certainly in my context here in Australia, is the idea of productive pedagogies. These are Australian framings. And we're looking at Australian culturally and responsive pedagogy. And I think this has resonance for Canada as well, because in our context as well, much of the literature that's coming often from the UK and the US is focused on particular groups, larger groups, Spanish English, and certainly a whole range of Indian languages in the UK. Whereas in Canada, and I think in Australia, we have this incredible linguistic diversity in our classrooms. So for example, I'm working in classrooms where we have between 7 and 17 languages spoken by students within one classroom. So we have this larger linguistic diversity that changes the pedagogies and the ways that we approach language learning in our classrooms. And I think in that sense, Canada and Australia are unique in terms of thinking about how this is framed in our schools particularly, and what we can do to take this up. I also think that translanguaging pedagogy has had a huge resonance all over the world and is continuing to do so. And we're getting some fantastic, exciting work that's coming out of the translanguaging work that's been done in classrooms. And I think 3 key things that are important to consider is the idea that we're looking at affirming and valuing multilingual identities, that we're engaged in this cross-linguistic understanding within our classrooms. So this kind of development of multilingual awareness, how we use languages in exciting ways and how we can actually think about this multiple repertoire, and also thinking about developing and extending students' linguistic resources. So this idea of going beyond celebration, I think, to consider how we actually place multilingualism, transcultural pedagogies at the centre of all of the things that we're doing, how we leverage it for learning. So in this presentation, I want you to maybe think, when you see some of the work that we're doing, some of the concerns that teachers have about using multilingualism in the classroom. And some of these things might be things that you have in your mind, particularly practitioners, administrators who are here, about actually censuring multilingualism in classrooms. So, and in the project that I've been working on, which I'm going to share in a little while, in schools, these are some of the concerns that the teachers have. And these are some of the things that we actually address within our research. Okay, we're exploring this idea of students' lack of proficiency in their first language, and how do we build on that in some ways in our classrooms if we're thinking about multilingualism. You know, teachers are worried about students being off task if students engaged in multilingual practices. The idea that they're monolingual, and so what skills do they have to offer in a classroom where they're actually building on multilingualism? Inadequate resources, excluding monolingual students. So I'm going to address these things as I talk through my presentation in terms of the research and findings that we've got from this study, but also for you to think about these things and keep them in mind when you're focused on the work that I'm going to present here. So these might be concerns for you as well. Another interesting thing, and I know there's some academics colleagues here as well, is thinking about pre-service teacher education and teacher education for new teachers going out in schools. What we know is that in our universities even, we're maintaining a monolingual, monocultural orientation. That we are not actually leveraging our pre-service teachers' knowledge and skills in higher education either. There's little acknowledgement of students' linguistic diversity or identities. Often we adopt deficit views about the students, develop deficit views about their own practices. And I'm conducting a study at the moment within my own university and across 4 metropolitan universities, where we're looking at the linguistic funds of knowledge of our pre-service teachers. And I have to say that the results are not hopeful. What we're finding is, even though I teach language to I teach English theory and methods and research methods in my own university to my pre-service teachers who are incredibly diverse. I work in a very diverse university, and we'll talk about the statistics of that in a little while. Students are still worried about their capacity for English, and they don't see the skills and understandings that they have really translating into teaching beyond the notion of being empathetic for students who are first language or dialect learners, English language learners. So I think this is an interesting area of research that we need to do a little bit more exploration of. So let me set the context for Australia, where I am this morning. This is the largest census data, last census data from 2016, the largest data set that we have. And of course, like you in Canada, we're having a new census this year, so we'll have up-to-date data. But I think what's important to think about here is the diversity that we have in Australia, and the idea that 49% of people are born overseas or have at least one overseas population. We're close to 26 million now, but this diversity, this rich, incredible cultural linguistic diversity is really exciting, I think, and something that we're really not taking up in Australia in the way that we should. We're still maintaining this monolingual, monocultural orientation. And I know from my research of Canada that about 21.5% of the total Canadian population are people from countries outside of Canada. And I understand that Calgary has the third highest number of immigrants of all provinces and territories. So again, we have to think about our context and think about the ways that we're positioning our students and positioning our learning and educational futures in our classrooms. I work in Western Sydney, which is the most diverse region in Australia, the most populous. We have large percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the highest population of new immigrants and people from a refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds. So this is just a snapshot of the languages that you can see that occur in Western Sydney, where I am, and I work in public education, in public schools, government-funded public schools, and 36% of our students speak languages other than English. And this little pink diagram I've got down here is New South Wales, the state that I'm in, and I'm in Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney. So our population here are over 50% of students from languages other than English. So high numbers of students who are multilingual in my region. I'll just give you a little snapshot as well of my university, so Western Sydney University. So university-wide, 41.3% of our students come from language backgrounds other than English. And in the School of Education where I am, it's 36%. This is just a little snapshot of a little pilot study that I did in my own university. So this is just 10 students, and you'll notice here that of these 10 students, only 9 were bilingual, the rest were multilingual. So the linguistic diversity within the pre-service teacher education program in my own university is really quite diverse. It's going back to this idea of how do we build on the linguistic capacities and recognise, acknowledge and extend the linguistic capacities of our pre-service teachers and of course our new incoming teachers. So here's the project. Exploring linguistic repertoire. So you can see it's been going for about 7 years and I am still working on this project. I'm about to do some work in preschools and early childcare centres, implementing the same sort of work, and we're also looking at middle schools as well. So in this project, which is funded by the New South Wales Department of Education, teachers are researchers along with children, and that really is this participatory nature of the research that's important. What students are doing is actually studying themselves as part of their classroom practice. That is, they're studying the ways that they read, write, talk, listen, and view every day inside and outside of school. And then we're using that for curriculum. So far, I've worked with over 1,000 students aged 6 to 15 years old in schools where between 65 and 99% of the population are multilingual. So our research questions are really these: what happens when young people are positioned as researchers of their own practices, studying the ways they read, write, talk, listen and view in one or more language and dialects inside and outside of school? What curriculum can be generated, and what can teachers and young people learn from each other? So these research questions are driving not only the work that we're doing in schools, but our findings and our analysis, and teachers and children are involved very much in this analysis. I'm going to concentrate today on sharing some of the work of the brilliant teachers and the students who I'm working with, lucky enough to work with in classrooms. Certainly, I'm going to turn to this notion of language mapping. And one of the reasons I'm talking a lot about language mapping is because I think this is a pedagogy that you can take up in your classrooms. And I really urge you to have a go at this and think about how it might work if you're a teacher in the classroom, and consider what this might look like in your classroom and how you might implement it if you can as one of those strategies. Okay, so as participant researchers, so the way this works in the classroom is I work alongside the teachers in the classrooms, and teachers have these questions that they're focusing. So how and in what ways can I learn about the linguistic funds of knowledge of my students and my communities? Okay, what will be learned? And then once I've learned this, what am I going to do about it in terms of learning more generally and looking at English and curriculum outcomes in particular? The students are researchers. So the way this works is I go into classrooms and we invite the students to be researchers. So I introduce myself and of course talk about the fact that I come from a university and that I'm training, working with teachers, teaching them how to become teachers in a university, which, you know, children from 6 to 15 find incredibly fascinating. One of the questions I always get is, do teachers sit on the floor when they're learning? We are inviting them to think about what they want teachers to know about them. Okay, what can we learn about ourselves if we engage in this practice of studying ourselves, the ways that we're reading, writing, and what do we want our teachers to know? So they're invited to share their information, to engage in research and share that information, not only with the teachers in their classroom and in their school, but by extension with me to other people who are learning to be teachers. So the students are trained in research methods. That is, they learn how to be researchers. We talk about what research is. They interview each other, come up with their own questions. Think about this idea of if we're talking about the language we use every day, what is it that we want to find out? What is it that we want to learn? So you can see here in terms of learning, this involves students in a whole range of activities, lots of talking, listening, reading and writing, great discussions in classrooms. It becomes very much engaging curriculum. And I think certainly young people are interested in talking about themselves. Who doesn't like talking about themselves? And so just to begin with, this becomes a really engaging project for young people. What I've got here is some research that was put together by the students themselves. Okay, so they say, okay, they're interviewing each other about the kinds of languages they speak, how many languages, where, with whom, and then they put their data together. Okay, the students keep diaries, they do observations, they interview each other and their families, and they're encouraged to do this in multiple languages. And what we're trying to do here is to get them to reflect on and extend the languages that they're using every day, as well as English. The data sets then are used, for example, by teachers for math lessons. So teachers support students in collecting this information. They engage in discussions about what does this information tell us about who we are, our class, our school, our community. And also they use it for, you know, lessons on means and averages and percentages and working with data. Okay. And I think this becomes a central kind of pedagogical tool that begins this work in classrooms. Who are we? What languages we speak, etc. So I think some of you might be thinking, okay, well, what about those students who are monolingual speakers? We're really involving everyone in this study. And so in that case, we're thinking about register dimensions, how their language changes for different audiences and purposes. So thinking about texting, playing sport, this notion of what language is appropriate for what audience and purpose. But also, interestingly enough, in a diverse community like Australia, even if students are monolingual speakers, they have grandparents, aunts and uncles, neighbours, friends who are speaking multiple languages. So they're really interested in actually exploring the multilingualism that occurs for them in their everyday lives. And also, I think more than ever, young people are in online environments where they're playing around with languages in a whole range of ways, things that they're interested in. So one of the things that that came out of our research is that the students were very much interested in K-pop. And so they were, I didn't even know what K-pop was, and they were going and visiting K-pop sites and downloading lyrics and trying to translate things and playing around with languages, visiting sites that they were interested in where multiple languages are spoken. So I think the world that students are in terms of their classrooms, the larger community, and even in the online world is far more diverse, and where students are using a whole range of languages and dialects to make meaning in incredible ways. So we're really looking at our whole class. This is great pedagogy for thinking about ways of being, knowing and doing. I keep coming back to that, for all students, not just for students who are multilingual or bilingual. Okay, so language mapping, I'm going to turn to this. So if you can imagine how this project works, so we've been in there and the students have trained to be researchers, they've collected their own information, and now they're actually, one of the pedagogies that we actually has been generated, I've generated out of this project, and then I really encourage you to try is language mapping. So we ask the students to think about how they use language every day, who they communicate with, in what languages, in what kind of places. So you can see here how register plays out even for students who are monolingual, and how they communicate, and then visually represent that. So the little diagram I've got here is a picture of put together by one of our students who's talking about translating on the phone for her parents, and the process of doing that. The language mapping task is basically a research methodology and a pedagogical strategy. So we're using it in both of those ways. So I've engaged in a whole range of ways to analyse the language mapping data. So we usually do a spatial analysis. We involve teachers and students and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Aboriginal and bilingual teachers' aides within our classroom in analysing these maps. We look at what's on the page, what can it tell us. We've done things where we've actually got the students to make maps, and then all of the students' names are taken off, and the teachers try to work out whose map they're viewing and what they can see in these maps. And I have to say that every time these maps are revealing things that teachers did not know about their students. So this really is, I guess, an identity text, a narrative inquiry that gives us information as teachers about our students, but gives students information about themselves and the things that they can do every day. So I'm going to show you some of the maps that have been produced by the students. And also I want you to kind of think about what you see here. What occurs to you? How could you, if you're a teacher in school or administrator, or even working with pre-service teachers, what could you do with these maps? I said that I use them and analyse them in a whole range of ways. The maps go home with parents. The students keep on adding to them. This is kind of an ongoing project. But also, I want you to, I've organised them into the themes, so sort of general themes that occur quite often in these maps. So all the maps I've got here are published in articles and books, etc. And I've sent some PowerPoint slides for you, so you can have a bit more time to look at these in your own time. But here's this first map, this kind of action-orientated narrative, which comes from the semiotic analysis of Kress and Van Leeuwen. But you can see here, this relationship between home and school comes out quite a lot. So the red box is school, and the dynamic, exciting practices on the left-hand side are all of things that occur in classrooms. So this child in particular was a very quiet child who rarely spoke in class, and this happened quite a lot. And the teacher realised that this child was the family translator. and that their linguistic skills were far greater than the teachers had actually anticipated in terms of their multilingual capacity as well. We often see a division between home and school. So often teachers think, okay, I'm always talking about home. I'm always trying to bring home into the classroom. But often students don't see this. They see this real division between the language practices of home and school. And there's always some kind of division. You can see in this one, a tree divides what goes on at home, what goes on at school. But you can see here too that students are starting to explore their own practices. We encourage them to use home languages to write in those, but unfortunately, as much as we can say that, we don't see that quite often in the mapping work. The students really concentrate on English, and certainly we can talk about why that is a little later. Again, this idea of the multilingual skills that students produce. So this child is 7 years old. And you can see, again, this idea of this division between all of the things that are happening. Again, it revealed rich skills of this student that the teacher didn't actually realise because the student wasn't talking very much, not very confident, not speaking English in the classroom. So it just opened up this world. And you can imagine that teachers are able to then use these maps and talk about them with students, get students to record themselves talking about their maps, sharing them with parents. And we have found that parents often added to them. It brought parents into the school. I saw my child doing this, what's happening in the classroom, what are you doing with these maps, etc. So it really generated a whole range of work and activity. Also, we see the multimodal, multilingual nature of what students are doing in all sorts of ways. So again, we're talking about register dimensions, how language changes for what audience and purpose, and certainly that's an outcome that we're working towards in our classrooms in terms of learning English and assessment. So we're actually meeting that by looking at our everyday practices as well. Students are thinking about how language changes, what they're doing in their everyday worlds. Semiotic analysis you can see going on here as well, this larger notion of meaning making. Students are also practicing, if you like, their own skills. So I think we want to go, certainly for me, beyond this idea of acknowledging the linguistic diversity and think about how we can extend it in real ways. Identity and language come up quite a lot, and that relationship has been foregrounded, certainly for teachers, in the work that we've been doing as well. And you can see how that's so prominent for students. In this one, you can see these are the words of Shaka. He's building a tower of language. The roof is his language, and it's establishing the whole building. So these conceptual, rich metaphors are generated from this mapping work as well. Migration, mobility, flexibility comes up a lot. And again, you think about the conversations that we can have, the ways this can lead to curriculum, the kind of rich understandings that are generated as a result of this. And I think we've already had this map as well. Language ideologies are central. So this map you can see here is a really interesting one. In the middle is the Australian Parliament House, and there's a tree of language. And certainly this generated conversations about what language should be spoken in Australia. Should we be multilingual? The students talked about experiences of speaking their languages in communities and homes, etc., and how that was perceived in their larger world. So these discussions about linguistic supremacy and language ideologies really are important and facilitated as a result of these maps. And again, this one here, we've got the plane for this child is symbolising their home language over all of these processes that take place in their everyday worlds. So for language mapping, maps are collected, they're analysed, they're taken home, and then teachers think about how they can be generated for curriculum. Just briefly, I'll show you that we've done this work with pre-service teachers as well. And these are some of the pre-service teachers maps. You can see these kind of divisions as well in this hierarchy of language, which I think is really interesting. And we can talk a little bit about that later. So what could you do with these maps? And I'm encouraging all teachers and administrators here to have a go at doing this. Some of the work that's been generated as a result of this is that we've engaged in a whole range of activities. Taken up Rahat's bilingual reading program, which has been rich, invited parents in to undertake multilingual writing projects, students pairing up and writing stories that they share in multiple languages across the classrooms. We've had, in one class, students created a book fair, a multilingual book fair. In another, we had cyberbullying taking place in the school, which was a real problem. And the students set about creating a multilingual campaign for cyberbullying. So they interviewed their parents in first language, and then they actually set up a campaign within the school to share this information as well, generating lots of conversations, essays about languages, country studies, involving parents and enlisting grandparents to come in and share skills and understandings, etc. So the richness of what happens as a result of this work and the curriculum that's been generated as well has really been supporting students learning generally, and then English in particular as well. We've done some place-based studies where the students are looking at the neighbourhood, going out and thinking about the languages that are spoken every day within their schools, using maps and cameras to create presentations, maths, they're making displays. You can see here in one of the classes, we had a class that had students who were new arrivals, and they were learning Aboriginal history as part of the curriculum. And then the students here actually found out more about their local community, and it took them back to looking at Aboriginal history and made sense in terms of their communities as well. We've had students create biographies and present them to their families in first language, where the parents came in and students spoke in home languages. I mean, it's been incredibly rich. Also, I think for teachers here, it's important to think about the fact that we are working still towards standards. So this is not something extra, but it's something that is taking place. And you can see I've just got a little snapshot of some of the standards that we're working towards, which are dominating what happens in teacher education. I think we're under siege in Australia, and I understand that there's some much more accountability taking place in Canada as well around teacher skills and competencies. What they look like and how we can use this curriculum to be able to do that. So I think these things really apply and actually enrich our classroom learning and help us to work towards outcomes. For students, I think what's happened, what's been revealed is that monolingualism is abnormal. It's multilingualism, it's normal. Students start to realise what they know and can do, and it's improved their confidence and their understanding. And I had some snapshot of some of the things that they've said here, and I've given you some slides so you can take some more time to have a look at these as well. We've had exhibitions of maps where we put those up in the school, and all the parents came out for an exhibition and talked about maps and viewed those in the school. There's been a whole range of things, and this is really up to the imagination of teachers. In terms of teachers, they begin to recognise the rich understandings of their students in every case, more than they'd actually recognised before. For parents, this really became important to them. And one of the interesting things, I think, too, in this research is that children encourage their parents to actually enrol them in after-school programs, in language learning programs, Saturday school, after-school language learning programs, which, of course, you can imagine thrilled the parents, thrilled the parent and the communities as well. So what are the affordances of this? I think hearing the voices of students is really important. Confidence, one of the exciting things for me is that the cognitive challenge of the work that was assigned has been increased. Often teachers were struggling to think about, well, I've got lots of students who are English language learners, speak languages lots of students who are speakers of languages other than English, and how do I involve them in this wider curriculum as they're still learning English? And I think teachers started to realise, wow, they can do so much more than I had realised, and the cognitive tasks certainly increased. We have evidence of improved student outcomes, certainly in multilingual, metalinguistic awareness and writing, and as I said, enrolment in community research programs. We certainly have some challenges. We can listen, but are we really hearing? We're inviting students to be researchers, but what will actually change in terms of our classroom? And sustainability is also an issue here as well. How do we facilitate change in terms of policy and assessment? And I think sometimes students realise that my language is not really important here. It's just English. And as much as we can say that, how do we get that message across? Okay, I'm going to finish up here. And what I've got in this slide is just some resources that you might want to go to. And I've tried to include things from early childhood, some secondary, and some of the explanation of the work that's been generated from this project. So thank you, everybody.
Wow, thank you so much, Jackie. As usual, this was a brilliant session. Thank you so much for all the knowledge and all the expertise and the ideas that you brought to the table for us to think about. I'd invite the audience to put their questions in the chat box if you have anything specific that you'd like to bring up. And
please, if you have any questions, if you want to ask anything, any processes, please do so. I'm happy to share anything and anything you might be interested in.
So I'm just monitoring the chat box, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps as we're doing that, you can begin by expanding a bit on the teacher education component, the work with the teachers, pre-service teachers, and language mapping. How is that coming?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, okay. What we've been doing is investigating pre-service teachers' linguistic funds of knowledge. So, and I think that I showed a little snapshot of that research, that often, you know, we're certainly in terms of, I can speak for myself as a university person, I'm always talking about this. I'm sharing my own work and saying we need to build on, it's more of an acknowledging multilingualism, but thinking about how it becomes central to teaching and learning and how we can build on and extend and explore, I think, and enrich ways of being, knowing and doing for everyone. Yet the pre-service teachers are not seeing like that. There's still a monolingual, monocultural orientation. And that, you know, I even found this a little shocking, is that some of my students said to me that they don't disclose that they are multilingual because they were a little bit worried that the university would think that their English was not good enough for the study, which I think is, that's just so disheartening for me. So the mapping we've been doing, certainly with pre-service teachers as well, and I think it's fantastic because and certainly with teachers, this happens as well. So when I work with teachers in schools, we all do a map, I and the teachers, because I think once you're starting to reflect yourself, it gives you a greater understanding of how this can be used in a whole range of ways. And I have to say that, you know, I've worked with close to 1,000 students. I've got thousands of maps, and I know I need to get out more. But they're fascinating. I mean, you know, they're all different. That's what I find incredible. I mean, I've tried to pick some themes, things that come up, but the ways people use them have been incredible. And what it's shown is this kind of monolingual orientation, even in pre-service teacher education. So we really need to go back there and think about what is the message that we're sending out. I mean, every student said, oh, I'm going to be empathetic for students whose first language is not English. But beyond that, there were no other schools. I need to get better in English. Do you know, we're being assessed in English. All of the work's in English. So that's what's important. So again, this idea of sustainability, how do we disrupt that notion?
So Jackie, building on that, there's a question for you. Wondering how you set up for the students to create such amazing pieces. Were they provided possible templates, or is the idea built through discussions?
Yeah, no, the idea is built through discussions, I think. So like I said, we first started out always in every classroom saying, okay, this is a project. We want to know more about you. We want to know about the way you use language every day, from children who are 6 right the way through to 15. So we explore, how do we use language every day? What languages, where, etc. So we open these discussions. Then students are trained to be researchers. Then they go about collecting their own data. How many languages do I speak? So we did this in small groups. They had little tape recorders. So when I go out and work in schools, I always have a box full of coloured pencils and stuff and tape recorders. And then the students record each other and they decide what questions to ask. Do you translate? What languages do you speak? Where do you speak them, etc. So there's lots of discussion that comes around the ways that we use language. And then usually we turn to this idea of, okay, now visually represent your linguistic life. And that's the same with pre-service teachers as well. That's what they're doing. They're representing. So there's no template. I sometimes show them, the teachers show them the maps they've created themselves. I've done that. And I'm sort of back and forth about this. You know, this teacher, sometimes kids will copy what they see. They don't feel confident. So we try to leave it open. I mean, we call it a map, but it's not really a map. You know, it's a way to just visually represent. So we encourage them to do this in any way that they like. And then the maps become an active thing. So no template was provided beyond a big piece of white paper and a whole bunch of coloured pencils, texts, etc. And also can be done online. Okay, so we can multimodal maps. Certainly in pre-service teachers, we're doing that much more, where we're using online environments, multimodality to create maps. But usually we've done it with pencils and papers and so on. And then those maps, just we keep revisiting them for more work, and it's the teachers that have been generating incredible work from these maps. That's why I think I asked you in the beginning, have a look at these maps, and you've got slides now. You can go back and have a look at those PowerPoint notes yourself. What could you do with it? I mean, where could you take it? How would it work in your classroom? What kind of input, you know, your children best, would work? And what sorts of things would it generate as a result of that? And I have to say the discussions have been incredible. You know, language ideology, students sharing how they feel about speaking multiple languages. It's generated essays about what languages should be included in Australia. I mean, the engagement, I think, has been incredible, that we're looking at authentic curriculum and we're working towards outcomes. We're still meeting the math outcomes by using the data. We're still writing, we're reading. Certainly, Rahat's amazing bilingual reading programs we've implemented as well. And that's generated incredible discussion, metalinguistic awareness, questioning skills, all those things that have come out of Rahat's data in the same way, and also invited parents in. I mean, the community support has been unbelievable, that they suddenly feel confident that they've got something to share, and they're in the classrooms.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other final questions? Anybody? Feel free to put them in the chat box. So we are at 2:20. Dr. D'warte, I think at this point, I would like to thank you for an incredible presentation today. This has just been amazing. Thank you so much for our audience. We have learned lots, and we definitely are using your strategies in our teacher education programs, in our second language teaching, courses. For myself, I'm a big fan of your methodology, so I think it definitely is having global impact in terms of changing our disposition. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. And on behalf of everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. It's been a pleasure. And I really encourage you to have a go. Really have a go. Try it. You know, even if you just go back to your classrooms and do a map, I think it's really worth it. Thank you. I hope I get to visit Canada sometime soon.
Yes, yes, for sure. We'll have you back in the Rockies.
I'd love to.
Sure. Yes, Jackie. Okay, everyone.
Thanks
a lot. I'll see you in a bit, Jackie.
Yes.
Thank you, Jackie. That was great. Amazing as always.
My pleasure. I hope it's useful and people can, you know, take away some stuff to use.
Yes. And for those of you just logging out, you can join us in the Wonder Room as well. The link is posted in the chat box.
Okay. So should we log out and go into that room?
Yes, yes, and feel free. And then you can use the other link for our meeting at 3. So there's a little bit of a break. It's 2:22 right now. So we have just over 30 minutes before we wrap up at 3 p.m.
Okay. Rahat, did you, you sent me that link, didn't you? It's on that
overview. Final table. If you look at
all the links,
column,
that's where I linked onto that.
Link. And the Wonder Room link is also at the end of the document. We have a link for the Wonder Room. But the thing is, you need to open the Wonder Room on Chrome. It's not working in Safari. And you cannot, you have to log out of Zoom in order to open Wonder Room. Otherwise, your voice echoes. So you'll hear an echo. So if you want to try that out, I'm going to go to Wonder Room right now.
Okay.
Okay. See you in a bit.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.